Welcome to the Diverse Minds podcast, where we give you the tips, tools, and techniques you need to be a mentally healthy and inclusive leader. Each week, you'll hear about a variety of topics linked to mental health, wellbeing, and diversity that will enhance both your professional practice and personal wellbeing.
Welcome to the 219th episode of the award-winning Diverse Minds podcast, and welcome to November. And this month's series is all about equity and wellbeing in parenting. So before we kick off, I wanted to ask, have you watched my TEDx talk about the connection between culture, race, and mental health? It's something you can watch in your break, as it's just 12 minutes long. And the link is in the show notes, and I'll also give it to you here. It is bit.ly/TEDx Wolves. That's WOLVESLO. And I really hope you enjoy it because it was a labor of love. And if you did, please leave positive comments on YouTube, share, and like. Also, don't forget to connect with me on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter. Okay, so why am I talking about parenting with equity and wellbeing in mind this month? This is something a friend and colleague who is also child-free by choice asked me to speak on, as I know many people are struggling with the concept of anti-racist parenting, as well as mothers in particular being able to look after their mental well-being while holding the load and doing lion's share of the work. And that, of course, is a fact across the globe, and there have been studies that show this. And I thought it would be great for me to listen to these conversations as a non-parent and think about how I can have conversation with my friends' children, if and when I needed to, in terms of anti-racism and supporting my many friends who struggle with their well-being, of course, while juggling parenthood, working, and other caring responsibilities. But also, many of us have children in our lives, even if we are not biological parents, adoptive parents, surrogate parents, etc. So, of course, parents' priorities are centered around protecting children's health and well-being, and so often their own mental and physical health is neglected. And the other element is equity in the home, especially in heteronormative relationships and talking about societal injustices. If it's not happening in a caring, supporting space, which we talk about the family space being, and I also want to acknowledge that actually family spaces can be very frightening, very scary, and not emotionally safe for many of us. This is then exacerbated in society. Also, the point around who has the time. Do we even have the emotional literacy to do this when we're all juggling so much and there's a lot of stress and pressure on us as humans at the moment, around the globe? And I think there's some very interesting points around life at the moment. We think it's become much easier with technology, but a friend had put on their personal Facebook profile around how 20, 25 years ago, we would go into a bank and there'd be people to help us. We'd go to the post office, there'd be people to help us. And now we're expected to do everything on our own at a click of a button. And is it really helping us? And how does it help anyone's stress levels and mental load? So I really hope you're enjoying the content and you want to keep up to date, not just with my podcast, but work that I'm doing more widely. Then join my bi-monthly newsletter. When you join up, you'll receive a copy of my 200 podcast episode guide, and the link is bit.ly/DMPG23. Okay, so the other aspect which I've touched on is, of course, the workplace, where a majority of the workforce are parents across all sectors. Now, if we're thinking about parenting with equity and well-being in mind, I think workplaces do have a really big part to play in this. So let's consider helping your team and staff with parenting using an equity and well-being framework. So firstly, I want to talk about abiding by flexible and agile working. It's more like hybrid working now, but mothers with children are at work in higher numbers than in any equivalent quarter over the last 20 years. While the overall level of all working age females in employment has risen, according to figures from the Office of National Statistics, parents of dependent children in a couple have the highest employment rates, with 93% of fathers and 80% of mothers in a couple in employment in April to June 2023 in the UK. So that is incredibly significant. And data showed that more than 75.6% of mothers with dependent children were currently in work, while the overall 16 to 64 female employment rate has hit 72.5%, closer to the early 2019 record at 72.7%. So there's 0.2% in it. With a third of working mothers also accessing special working arrangements such as flexible or term time hours, a higher level than compared to fathers, 23.6%. I mean, that is significant. It is clear that many employers are reimagining work to allow better access to those with caring responsibilities. But it feels like we've still got a long way to go. And I remember being at a conference many years ago, and someone from a big insurance firm said, And I'm guessing you'd probably heard it somewhere else. So we talk about working mothers, but no one sort of says, oh, working fathers, and working fathers need to be there for their children more. So, and this is a rhetoric we see all the time in the Western media and the global north and the UK press. So there's a lot of work to do around wording, how we view that. And I also remember talking to some friends years ago, and shared parental leave had just come in. And I said, oh, you're going to do shared parental leave? And she said to me, no, because my partner would think that was too radical. That scene is too radical. I was like, wow, if you're responsible for creating a life and a child, why is it radical to take shared parental leave? Now, they might have changed their opinion, I don't know, but that definitely was said to me. So I think that's really interesting. The second point is around if we really want to ensure equity and well-being for parents in our workplaces, is letting people have time off for appointments if they or their children are unwell. So there are around 68% of women and 57% of men with mental health problems are parents. Now, I don't want to say problems. I want to say, I've taken that from the Mental Health Foundation. I want to say mental ill health, or have a diagnosis of mental ill health, which of course they can recover from. But we know under times of stress and pressure, everyone's mental health is I'm going to use the word suffers, and clearly if there's ongoing mental ill health and recovery is a process, there's unnecessary stresses on people, of course that is going to have, it's very likely to have a negative impact on mental well-being. So we've got a significant percentage of people who are working and have mental ill health. And of course, the most common mental health problems experienced during pregnancy and after birth are anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress disorder. And let's not forget, there will be specific impacts on Black, global majority, and diaspora communities. We know that it's a hideous stat that 5 times more, that Black women are 5 times more likely to experience very, very shocking, unsupported, and not listened to births, and they're likely to suffer trauma and follow on medical impacts from their birth than white women. Asian women are 2.5% more likely. I don't know the stats for Southeast Asian women, Latinx communities, or Arab communities, but of course, whether they are diaspora, newly arrived, or long-established diaspora, we know that the outcomes are very different for communities that don't identify as white. And we can talk about this in the workplace, I think, in keeping in touch meetings and things like that. Of course, we don't want to dredge up trauma and make people talk about their birth story, but we might want to check in and say, how was it? Did you get what you need? Is there anything we can do as a workplace? The third thing is creating space for parents to talk about equity in parenting. So this could be through staff networks, speakers, thinking about this broadly, and sharing forums if you don't want to create something internally, if and where appropriately facilitated. And I think this is really important, because if we think about the number of working adults in the UK that are parents, we spend a lot of time at work. So why are we not creating these forums? Now, of course, if people are working in hybrid ways, we can still do this online. We could also talk to our employee assistance program and see what support they can provide, and thinking about that parental experience. So it's always a spectrum. It's always going to be varied. The fourth thing is very practical. It's about childcare support. And the stats are that for most working parents, the cost of childcare is upwards of £7,000 a year on average for part-time childcare for a child under 2. I mean, that really, really shocks me. I just look at that figure and I think, wow. So this, of course, is, given the figures, it's hugely is going to, given the figures, it's very likely to outweigh income. Or I know people that are paying more for their childcare than they are for their mortgage. And many families and people with children end up paying to go to work. And when I say families here, there's the nuclear family, but I'm also thinking about any single parents that maybe the siblings, aunts, uncles, grandparents, friends are also supporting with the childcare. So they can end up paying to go to work. And that's according to the Institute of Public Policy Research, the IPPR. So I really, there's kind of, it's a bit of a political hot potato sometimes that this gets wheeled out. I feel like it's something very easy to solve when you look at the numbers of working parents. This is something, and like social care for adults and people that care for elders, this is something that really we need to look at. And I don't think it would be that horrendously difficult to solve, actually, when there is such a need for it. I think it's also about specific wellbeing support for parents that takes into account culture, values, and preferences. So there's a lot about what is the right way to parent, what is the white way to parent. One example will be this constant debate about what in the global north is called co-sleeping. And for many of us from global majority cultures, in fact, I didn't do what's called co-sleeping. I didn't sleep in the same bed as my mum, interestingly. In fact, I was known to say, oh, no, I'm going to sleep separately. You can come and sleep in my room if you want. But that's a very natural part of so many global majority cultures around parenting. And this kind of judgment, and actually now it's called attachment parenting. And I remember the awful debate with the wonderful, bless her, rest her soul, Peaches Geldof, and the hideous Katie Hopkins, and she was completely criticizing her parents, her parenting style, and saying, oh, it's crap co-sleeping and it's this and that. And I thought, wow, this is so interesting, this kind of perception that there's a right way to parent and where that comes from. Now, I appreciate there can be dangers of children being suffocated. Friends have talked to me about this, but a lot of that has come from, often if there's a parent who is substance misusing, they may not recognize that there's a child in the bed. A lot of that is from Victorian sort of working practices where it was predominantly men in labor roles would come in potentially having had too much alcohol and not know that the child was in the bed, whereas for global majority cultures that looks quite different. It's often the mother with the children in a separate bedroom. I'm being very broad brushstroke. We know that global majority communities consist of hundreds if not thousands of subcultures within that, but yeah, I find that really, really interesting. And so when we're having conversations, how do we have conversations around this in a way taking into account culture, values and preferences? Another thing is around feeding children chilies, actually, which might sound weird, but some of my really close friends, they're Ghanaian, and one of her daughters was weaned in the UK, the other daughter was weaned in Ghana, and in Ghana they just blitz up the adult food and give it to the child quite early on. So one of her daughters can really handle a lot of chili and the other daughter can't. And the same for me, I just had blitzed up adult food. And again, how, separate baby food, separate food. And I do find it interesting when my friends, certain friends will have separate meal times for their children or also cook their children different meals. So that's interesting, isn't it, in terms of cultural perspectives, because that's just not in my cultural framework. And then finally, recognizing that parenting is not one size fits all. So actually nuclear families, not so much anymore necessarily, or maybe people have nuclear families for a time. And I think it's also remembering that family dynamics change. So we have same-sex parents, adoptive parents, guardians, surrogacy, blended families, and the barriers to benefits with this. So what I mean is it's not the setup that people decide they want to have or they do have, but how the terminology and the wording. So often on with same-sex parenting, my understanding is, and I've had people talk to me about this, if you do shared parental, it's assumed that the term is paternity leave. If you've got a same-sex couple of two women, the wording and one of the women has to take paternity leave. That's not great. So maybe we can't change HMRC, but can you put a submission in and say, hey, this is what's going on in our workplace. It would be really great if you could update the information, but also look at the terminology and wording in your own policies. So feed this language into the policies and ask how staff want to be supported, want to be recognized and referred to within your policy, practice and procedure documents. And also do check out my episode with Jenny Saft on recognizing different ways to have a family, and her company that she set up based on this infertility. So I don't know if any workplace has got all of this right, but it is about remembering a majority of your workforce is likely to be a parent or be a parent in the near future. That might be biological parent, adoptive parent, etc. Letting people have time off for appointments if they or their children are unwell. Creating space for parents to talk about equity in parenting, because this is part of our working life. Think about your childcare support. How could you enhance it as much as possible? Specific wellbeing support for parents that takes into account culture, values, and preferences. And again, those conversations with your EAP or any partners that you work with on this is really, really useful. And remembering the spectrum of parenting and that family dynamics change. So I really, really hope you enjoyed this episode. And if you did, please share on social media. And why not leave me a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcast from. And don't forget to work with me and find out how I can help support your workplace in terms of thinking about the spectrum and supporting a variety of people. And the resources in this episode are UK labour market stats, Mental Health Foundation statistics on family parenting and mental ill health, the Bernardo's Guide for Parenting on White Privilege, and episode 135, Recognising Different Ways to Have a Family. So in this series, we're going to be talking to some parents on their parenting journeys and what they do. And next week, do join me when I talk to the amazing Professor Keon West about raising anti-racist children and being an anti-racist parent. So until then, everyone, take care.
Thanks for listening to the Diverse Minds podcast. Don't forget to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you access your podcasts from. You can also connect with me on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Tune into next week's episode of the podcast, where I'll bring you more insights on mental health and inclusion. Bye for now.